In the years leading up to World War I, the Ottoman Empire was developing close relations with Germany. Constantinople had requested aid from Berlin in the shape of military expertise and civil engineering projects. During World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II saw the Ottoman state as a useful partner in his attempt to challenge the Allies. By appealing to his position as Khalif, Sultan Mehmed V could call upon the spiritual loyalty that Muslims around the world held to his status as leader of the Muslim community. Considering the tens of millions of Muslim Indians, this provided the Central Powers with an excellent opportunity to undermine the British position on the Indian subcontinent. And so a joint German-Ottoman mission was to be sent to Afghanistan, in a bid to persuade the Afghan Emir to join the war effort and attack British India. But despite the popularity of the idea amongst the Afghans, the diplomatic mission would encounter resistance when they arrived in Kabul. Prior to World War I, there had already been significant contact between Afghanistan and the Ottoman Empire. At some point in the future, I'll do a video on the topic, but for now, it's important to know that when Emir Habibullah ascended the throne in 1901, there were a number of migration waves to Afghanistan from the Ottoman state. This comprised non-Afghans seeking work and opportunity, as well as Afghans who were returning from exile. The most prominent of the latter was Mahmud Tarzi, a distant member of the royal family who would go on to become a prominent nationalist thinker. On behalf of the Emir, Tarzi invited numerous Ottoman experts he had contacts with to help Afghan state-building efforts. A military academy was established that was headed by Ottoman officer Mahmud Sami Bey. There was also a secret faction known as the Young Afghans, a group of Afghan reformers who emulated the CUP party that spearheaded the Young Turk Revolution. This meant that by 1914, the royal court at Kabul had a growing Turkophile influence. In addition to this, there was also the presence of Indian Muslims in the capital who had fled British-controlled India and brought with them their anti-imperialist views. As a result, Afghanistan became a hotbed for anti-British activity as pan-Islamic networks began to form between Afghans, Indian Deobandi clerics, and Ottoman military officers. The Afghan ruler, however, was much more conservative in his political outlook. There had been an agreement between his father Abdul Rahman and the British in the 1880s, which established British control of Afghan foreign affairs in exchange for a subsidy to the Emir. Habibullah had renewed this in 1905 and even paid a visit to India 2 years later. Whilst his lack of intransigence towards the British was interpreted by some Afghan reformers as submissive, Habibullah remained dedicated to the idea of gaining complete independence for his country. He had hoped that this could be earned rather than fought for. His conformist temperament was at odds with much of the royal court, which was largely split between progressive modernists and traditionalists, both of whom wanted more decisive action taken against the British. With such a fertile environment to spread their cause to, the Ottomans and Germans conspired to send a mission to Kabul in the autumn of 1915. But first we need some context about the German-Ottoman alliance, so I'll hand it over to my collab partner Stefan from History Hustle.
How did the German-Ottoman alliance start? The Ottoman Empire needed a strong partner, and that became Germany. So how did the Ottoman-German relations develop? The German Kaiser Wilhelm II visited the Ottoman Empire in 1898, starting in Istanbul, Constantinople, and traveling through the Turkish and Arab regions, visiting cities at Jerusalem and Damascus, where he proclaimed, "May the Sultan and his 300 million Muslim subjects scattered across the earth who venerate him as their Khalif be assured that the German Kaiser will be their friend for all time. The Ottoman Empire was strategically important for Germany, as Eastern Anatolia was seen as the gateway to Central Asia. Plans were made for the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. Construction began in 1903, but it wasn't finished when 1914 came around. It did deepen the ties between the two powers. In the wake of the Balkan Wars, the Germans also sent military advisors to reform the Ottoman Empire. They were led by Prussian officer Otto Liman von Sanders. He went to Istanbul by the end of 1913. Von Sanders was astonished by the bad state the Ottoman army was in, and he gained control over a Turkish army corps.
Thanks, Stefan. Don't forget to check out his video for a more in-depth look into the alliance after you're finished with this one. I'll leave a link in the description and the end screen. The hope of the diplomatic mission was to convince Habibullah to join the Central Powers and organize a combined invasion of India to liberate it from British rule. Afghanistan would help bog down Allied forces from the European and Middle Eastern fronts, whilst also disrupting the military and economic supply routes between India and Britain. The diplomatic expedition is remembered in the West as the Niedermayer-Hentig expedition after the army officers who led the German contingent of the mission, Oskar von Niedermayer and Werner Otto von Hentig. It should be noted that there was some discord within the Ottoman government that the Germans were overly aggressive and domineering in their early efforts to organize the diplomatic mission. The decision for the Ottoman and German contingents of the mission to travel separately may even reflect this friction. The Ottoman group was initially led by Hussein Rauf Bey and later Mehmet Kazim Bey, while the Germans were joined by the seasoned spy Wilhelm Vasmus, the German counterpart to Britain's T.E. Lawrence. Both parties travelled through eastern Syria to Persia via Aleppo and Baghdad. Whilst in Persia, the Ottoman contingent was joined by Indian Muslims who were working at the British consulates, bringing the total of their group to 25 men. A major concern was that Persia was within the Anglo-Russian sphere of influence and was a key overland supply chain for the Allied powers from British India to the Russian Caucasus. To evade Anglo-Russian surveillance, the Ottoman delegation split into 3 separate groups to ensure that at least one of them reached Afghanistan. The German group reached Kabul in August 1915, whilst the Ottomans arrived in October that year. The joint mission was warmly received by Emir Habibullah, who arranged for Hayri Bey, an Ottoman captain and military instructor who was training the Afghan army, to give a military salute and parade to their new guests. The visitors brought gifts for their hosts in the shape of gold and weapons. The diplomatic mission ignited the ambitions of the reformers at the royal court. It found a sympathetic audience in the Emir's brother, Prince Nasrullah, the leader of the traditionalist faction, and the Emir's son, Prince Amanullah, the head of the progressive faction. But for the Emir himself, it was a headache. Stuck between a rock and a hard place, he had to employ all his skill in diplomacy to maneuver the situation. He knew the extent of the anti-British sentiment at his court, but he had also been impressed enough of the British capabilities during his visit to India that the prospect of war against the mighty British Empire seemed unattractive to him. Upon the arrival of the mission in Afghanistan, the Emir received letters from both the Viceroy of India and King George V, imploring him to remain neutral. To the delight of the British, Habibullah was committed to a strict policy of neutrality, refusing to commit his forces to the Central Powers' cause, whilst at the same time refusing to kick out the diplomatic mission. Throughout the winter of 1915 and the spring of 1916, Habibullah continued to demonstrate his considerable skills in balancing the interests of the Allied and Central Powers in a turbulent world racked by a global conflict. He supplied details of his meeting with the Germans and Ottomans to the British, and implored them to pay attention to his actions rather than the rhetoric he used to placate his citizenry. Eventually, he would remind his subjects that a jihad required the approval of a ruler as well as people of authority, quoting verses from the Quran to substantiate his claims. In the end, the Ottoman-German mission came to nothing despite offering the Emir vast sums of money and weapons. In May 1916, the mission left Afghanistan without having achieved its aims. For Habibullah, he showed great diplomatic cunning to navigate a tricky situation. But in the long term, this likely led to his downfall. The anti-British sentiment amongst his people was so high that many in the royal court lost trust in their ruler. When World War I finished, Habibullah hoped that his appeasement of the British would allow Afghanistan to be granted complete sovereignty. When the British refused to sanction this, Habibullah's fate was sealed. The desire amongst Afghans for independence had reached a boiling point, and so it is no surprise that in February 1919, Amir Habibullah was assassinated whilst on a hunting trip to Jalalabad. Who or why he was killed has never been determined. Most likely it was another case of a ruler falling out of touch with the wishes and desires of his people. Thank you guys for watching. I want to give a shout out to my Patreons for their continued support. Make sure you give History Hustle's video on the Ottoman-German alliance a watch. Stefan's channel is awesome if you're interested in European military history, specifically modern European military history. And don't forget to check out my second channel, Street Food Bites, if you like watching delicious street food being prepared. Until next time, peace!